Namaskaram, Namaste. I am Dr. Meera Alagaraja. I work as the Associate Dean for the Office of Innovation and Strategic Partnerships at the University of Louisville in the United States. I'm originally from Rajapalayam, Tamil Nadu. And today I will be talking about Swamiji's understanding of psychology. And what we'll do today is we'll focus on understanding his ideas and what was his contribution and how is it relevant in today's world. So today in our worlds of stress, with family, with everything that we're dealing with, how can Swamiji's ideas be relevant? How are they useful? How can we apply his understanding and his views in a good way that can help us? So to begin with, I think one of the things I want you all to think about when we think about Swamiji is that he is a bridge. He's a bridge between the old, which is ancient India and its wisdom, and the bridge between the new, which is when he went to the West in the United States. He was a crossover, bringing these very different ideas together. And he was the bridge. He was building a bridge, and he is even today. His Swamiji's work it's helping us understand some of the very, very complex problems and challenges that not only face India, but they're also facing the US. They're facing the whole world. And so what are these two worlds or two different worldviews that Swamiji was trying to bridge or bring about this greater understanding between the two worlds, between the East and between the West? So if you think about it in the context of psychology, of understanding, one thing we have to think about, especially in the East and specific to India, is the yoga of psychology, right? The yoga psychology from Patanjali Yoga Sutras. In contrast, when you think about the West, we think about modern psychology. And right away, we understand that these two are very different systems. And so when Swamiji is talking from the point of view of Vedanta, he's trying to find that unity. He's trying to understand how can we integrate these different worldviews. And so in bringing more understanding between different cultural aspects, I think he makes a great contribution. And his work and his writing and his experiences, everything about Swamiji is wonderful because he's helping us. Even today, he's helping us understand how these connections can be useful for us. So when we think about the East, we take for granted our understanding of the mind, the intellect, and the ego. And this is never mentioned. You don't hear mentions of this in neurology or psychology, these specific terms. When you think about our inner self or our internal working of our minds, which is very Eastern, very Indian. On the other hand, when you think about the West, Swamiji himself says this, we talk about the subconscious mind in the Western psychology. Really, it's diluted, or when you think about it, it's really from the Freudian sense. And that's so far removed from yoga. Again, when he talks about the West, Swamiji, he's emphasizing when you talk about the Atman or the self, he's talking about this thin veil that it's between the depths of our subconsciousness or the heights of superconsciousness. That's the focus of the yoga of psychology from the East. And when you think about the West today, they talk about consciousness. They're making these advances, but those are, again, very different views about what is the inner self, what is the working that goes on internally in our body, our mind, etc. There's a interesting tidbit about Swamiji that I wanted to share. So he took a very short course. It was maybe for 3 months from the Kolkata Medical College. And it's interesting, this was a course on physiology. So Swamiji also, what is interesting about him is he's taken these courses, his curiosity about knowing different systems, knowing different courses or knowledge. He has this vast energy for, just taking in information, processing it, and then through his phenomenal powers of concentration, his broad, love for the whole of humanity, you can see how he's giving us all of these ideas that are very, very relevant to us today. The other thing also, as we think about contrasting the East and the West in terms of understanding of psychology, right? So in the East, think about this idea, which is we take it for granted. You know, when you hear talks on Vedanta, we'll hear different Swamis or different experts in Vedanta say the mind goes out, it grasps the object from the external objects, and then it comes back, and then it gives us, that's how we understand our environment and the world. From the Western point of view, you know, how they break it down, they'll say, okay, rays of light enters via the optic nerves, and then here's how. So you can see that they focus on the physiology, the brain functioning, how all of that, the brain is important in making sense of the world. So again, you can see very different views, right? So ancient and Hindu idea understood that the mind is very important. This is very important. The experience, the quality of our mind is very important in how we experience the rest of the world. And Swamiji brought this to modern light. And Swamiji was, in these times, imagine him about 120, 125, 30 years ago, right? So he's talking about all these ideas. And then at that time, modern psychology, according to the West, was just beginning. Like there was just, the roots were being set. So, but if you think about psychology today, the biggest investments in progress is in what Swamiji calls the science of all sciences. It is in psychology. And you know, some of the early founders of psychology in the Western world, people like Carl Jung, you know, they started to think about, you know, all of the psyche that goes on behind the mind, right? And in 1930s, Carl Jung visited Belur Math. So there's some overlap of some of these founders, of William James and others, who met Swamiji. You know, they met Swamiji, and so there's ideas of Vedanta. There has been an overlap, understanding, exchange of ideas have been happening. But Swamiji has been very instrumental in bringing many of these ideas to the forefront. So again, like, let's continue the comparison between the East and the West. You know, when you look at neurology or brain sciences, now they're getting more of a solid foundation. Now they're talking about psychosocial aspects of the mind, why it's important for finding satisfaction, happiness, meaningfulness in our life, finding meaning in our work, in our lives. All of that is very important. And again, when you talk about neurology and neurosciences, think about it from the Eastern point of view, right? Like, so in India, like when we talk about the brain centers, we talk about the nerves, the nervous system, and nerves as in the nadis. And think about the alternate nostril breathing that some of you might be familiar with. So when we do the alternate nostril breathing, what we do is we're trying to bring the mind back to its center. So just focusing on the here and the now. And sometimes that's all that we need to be able to manage the stress that's facing us in the moment. Or we want to shift that focus a little bit, take it a little bit inward before we can be fully present, before we can take on the challenge or the stress of the world that's just outside. So think about it that way. But again, another interesting thing about the contributions of Swamiji is, you know, everything that Swamiji just talked or mentioned about. So for example, in the West, when he first started talking about the psychology of yoga, especially about Patanjali Yoga Sutras and Raja Yoga, he was surprised at the interest that the Western audiences had in thinking about the breath, the pranayama, as a way of, you know, managing the mind. And that was fascinating for the Western audiences. So Swamiji just glanced and touched on that. And today, if you just think about yoga, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the US. Again, if you think about psychology around the world, not just the US, but also in India, you can see the psychology of yoga, psychology of just understanding your mind. All of these have become multi-billion-dollar industries. So anything that Swami just paid attention to or just talked about it, you know, it's had this, the whole of the world has become immersed trying to understand this. It's fascinating. And that's really the power of Swamiji. And we should also say, you know, Thakur, Sri Ramakrishna, and also the Holy Mother is their attention, even if the smallest attention from their end. And you know, you have these mushrooming of all of these different sciences and interests in ourself, our inner self, and trying to find how ways we can engage, ways we can be more happy, more fulfilled in our lives. Now let's move on to two other ideas of Swamiji, especially as it relates to psychology, which I think is very important. So one of the things Swamiji says is, especially in the West, one of the ideas about anything, not just psychology, is it's always judged by what's the utility of whether it's psychology or any other idea. What is it useful? What are the practical benefits? And when we talk about practical benefits, essentially what we are saying is, can it reduce misery or suffering in my life, and simultaneously can it grow my happiness? Essentially, that's what we're looking for. That's the utility. That's what is the benefit of something that we are doing, right? So think about any practice that you're doing. You're like, how does it benefit me right now, right here? Or does it, again, increase my happiness or reduce my suffering? Those are very crucial. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's how that utilitarian point of view drives many of the things from a Western point of view. But then again, Swamiji again offers another beautiful idea, which I wanted to quote. He says, but even taking the Western idea of utility as a judge, by which you want to judge psychology, by even those standards, psychology is still the science of all sciences. Why is that, he says, because we are all slaves to our senses. We are slaves to our own minds, both conscious and unconscious. So what does he mean? And here's what he says. He says, we're constantly doing things against the better side of our nature, right? So, we know that we should not eat certain kinds of food. We know we should be more healthy. We know we should take a walk. We know we should spend more time with nature. And yet against our own better nature, maybe we're looking at our phones, we are checking something on WhatsApp, or we're spending more time in computers, or doing these other things rather than really doing what might actually is more beneficial for us, right? And then he says that even when we want to think in our mind that we want to be different, we want to do better things, we are not able to. So that's what he says, that we are slaves to our own minds. But he also says we have become slave to everyone else's minds too, right? So think about being on Facebook, trying to send pictures, all of these things that take a lot of our time. So that's what we're doing. And whether we are it's good or bad, doesn't make a difference. The bottom line is we are not really in control of our minds. There seems to be some other kinds of things that take over. And so according to Swamiji, he says the reason we do that is because deep down, we have all of in our subconscious, we have stored all of these experiences, all these thoughts and acts from the past, not only past in this life, but even past lives. And therefore, when they come up, it's much harder for us to follow what our better nature is advising us to do. Right? So then what happens, he says, is we don't understand, and then we don't understand our own mind. And therefore, what we do is blindly and unquestioningly, we just do whatever our mind is asking us to do. And so then Swamiji he comes with this wonderful advice, and he says, how can we call ourselves free when we cannot even control our own minds? And so he says, when you cannot even hold your minds on a subject, focus it on a point so that it excludes everything else, even for a moment, how can we call ourselves free? But then even as he points this out, Swamiji does a beautiful thing. He says, all right, so then what can we do? And he said, how can we get the mind under the control of our will? So how can we free ourselves from the tyranny of all of these influences that are coming at us? And how can we do that so that our lives are meaningful, that we live a life that's worthy, that makes a contribution to everyone else around us, right? To ourselves. And this is where he brings us back to the mystics, like Thakur Sri Ramakrishna, so that he says, they have been able to explore the deeper nature, the deeper powers of the mind, because they've gone to the depths of the subconsciousness, or as he says, to the heights of superconsciousness, and they have noticed what goes on, not only in just their minds, but what is going on in others' minds. And he says, that's building of real character. And then Swamiji says, if you want to study the mind, we have to be very systematic. We have to systematically train it. And we have to keep practicing ways in which we can bring the mind to our control. And how can we do that? And so one of the things that Swamiji suggests that we can control the mind by going deep into our subconscious. He says, so these are recommendations, right? So what are practical aspects that Swamiji is recommending? So one of the things is, are we able to meditate in the morning and the evening? So what is that practice? And I wanted to leave you all with this one thought is, when we are little, just think about that. When you're little, our parents or whoever's taking care of us wanted to make sure that we brush our teeth every day and every morning and night. And so that was like trying to take care of our dental hygiene. And in a very similar way, if you want to take care of the hygiene of our minds, then meditating once in the morning and the evening is an absolute requirement. And that's the way we can build ways in which we can start understanding the power of the power of our subconscious. And through that, we can find ways to be more free, more free to engage with the world, more free from our own selves, our own desires, and our own patterns of mind that hold us back. And so through meditation practice, or as I said earlier, like alternate nostril breathing or nadi shodhan, to these different practices of breathing and control, we will be able to bring parts of our mind. We can systematically train the mind so that we are more productive, that we are more present for our work, we are more present for our families, we're also more present to ourselves, we're more aware of ourselves, of our existence, and of our true purpose in life. So with this, I want to wrap up this very brief understanding of psychology according to Swamiji, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Namaste.